Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Troy Moling and thanks for joining us today on Market Journal. Show looks a little different this week. We're broadcasting from my house, but through the power of technology, you probably won't notice much of a change at all. Before we start, I do want to mention, as United States and global health officials continue to address the spread of COVID-19, UNL is monitoring the situation. Updates can be found at covid19.unl.edu and on the Market Journal website. Beginning the broadcast today, as producers know, extreme weather conditions can cause financial strain on a farm, and 2019 was chock full of them. Market Journal's Maddie McIntosh recently spoke with Nebraska Extension Farm and Ranch Management Analyst Glennis McClure about the stress producers may be feeling and how Nebraska Extension is here to help.
Spring of 2019 in Nebraska is not a time many in the agriculture world will recall fondly. Floods, blizzards, and a canal collapse left producers wondering how they would navigate the long road ahead. And with COVID-19 in 2020, the new restrictions and policies have taken a toll on the industry as well.
With the conditions that the cattle were under, that caused some low birth weights, rates actually this year. And many of the fields stayed underwater, and so again, a lot of the fields still need to be rebuilt, or aren't even producible yet this year. But the low commodity prices, having to do with the trade wars, the lingering effects also of the African swine fever in China has caused havoc with the market. Now, with the COVID situation, farmers are getting out and getting busy in the fields now, which hopefully is a real positive thing for them. But we've seen recently cattle prices really falling off, dairy prices. We've heard about the cases where some of the milk's getting dumped. Really, I guess with things contributing over the last several years, the farm debt increasing has really contributed to a lot of things.
For those feeling the stress on their farms, Nebraska Extension is spreading the word about ways to seek help both financially and mentally.
Our folks in the Ag Economics Department really started 2 programs this last year. We have 4 area economists that provided a program called Know Your Numbers, Know Your Options. But we do have a group of us that are working on getting that program online. So you'll see that eventually. Then also, Nebraska Strong Financial Services was a new program started by Dr. Corey Walters and others in the department. And this is a program where we work individually with farm families and look at their financial situation, sort of one-on-one. We help them with cash flow planning. Benchmarking is a big part of that program, whereas if you determine where you're at financially, how do you compare to others that are maybe doing well, or sort of the top 1/3 or the different categories. So all of this is to help folks look at their analysis and to be able to make some decisions utilizing good, sound financial information. The Rural Response Hotline is very active. They do have some vouchers available for mental health services, and so that is a really key place to send folks or to have folks call and visit at this point in time. Also, of course, we have the Suicide Prevention Hotline, that if the situation looks like that and you've determined that someone is thinking of that, try to get them to visit with someone on the hotline. And then the University of Nebraska, we have a team of folks, a rural wellness team, and we have a rural wellness website. And so there's a wealth of resources on there, and I would suggest or have folks take a look at that and use the resources that we posted on that line.
If there's one thing Nebraskans are good at, it's looking out for each other. Through thick and thin, communities within the state have continued to show how strong they are. And in these uncertain times, Glennis says that's more important than ever.
It's really, really important to try to be a good listener to those folks and to help them connect with resources. Don't just let it go. I know right now it's so challenging in that we don't see a lot of people day to day, but hopefully we're staying connected and visiting with them and checking in on them. And if you really sense that something is really going sort of haywire, make sure you really help them connect with the resources.
Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Maddie McIntosh.
Thanks, Maddie. The phone numbers and website links Glennis mentioned can be found on the Market Journal website. And like you just heard, and as we've said before, reaching out is Nebraska Strong. And remember, you are not alone. Let's get a check now on our markets for the week, and I'm joined by author and analyst Elaine Kub. Between planting and a pandemic, it's a time in ag unlike any other. And one way those are intersecting is with the recent closure of a major pork processing plant in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. It's a plant that accounts for about 5% of U.S. pork production. And I began the conversation with Elaine this week by asking what this means for ag.
It's a very bad omen of things to come. I mean, by itself, it's a struggle for the regional producers that would be delivering to that plant, but it's a bad omen. Like I mentioned, there is always the potential that more plants are going to experience the same virus outbreak and have to shut down for some periods of time or slow down for some periods of time. So for the short term, it doesn't really affect consumers because there's enough cold storage and enough domestic meat supply. Nobody should be worried about that. But it does back up, as you mentioned, to the agricultural producers who would otherwise be delivering animals to these plants. That's the people who are going to be affected, have to pull back deliveries, have to delay deliveries. And the one thing that's a little bit convenient about the hog market is that it is so vertically integrated that they can communicate through their contracting system, you know, who needs to deliver where and get that timed through. But when this starts affecting the beef, a bit more of a mess.
And you cut out just for a little bit there. Did you mention the beef and maybe even other proteins that could feel some ripple effects from this?
Yes, when this starts affecting the beef industry, or if the beef packing plants have to shut down or slow down to the same degree, it will be much more complicated to get the scheduling and the delivery of the animals sorted through a complex supply chain.
What do you think, and this is kind of looking ahead, what do you think the protein outlook looks like for maybe the next 6 to 9 months as we're dealing with COVID?
Yeah, price-wise, retail prices remain strong. The people are going to the grocery stores and buying these foods that they're preparing there. But getting that passed through, there will be volatility. We see the live cattle futures contracts and the feeder cattle futures contracts actually staying pretty steady this week, which is a surprise. And in my opinion, there's still room for those contracts to move upwards to match the cash market. But through the next 6 months, I believe there is potential in the cash market itself to have these stuttered effects if you can't be delivering animals.
Okay, let's kind of switch gears. Let's look at planting for a couple minutes. Here in Nebraska, we're still starting things up, still getting the ball rolling. So kind of give us a sense of what it's like for your part of South Dakota. You seeing any delays? Are farmers excited for the season ahead? Just anything you can tell us.
Well, first of all, let's back up and remember that there's still corn to be harvested. Up in North Dakota, they still have only 83% of the corn harvested from last year. So that's got to happen first. Planting season is underway for spring wheat. That's going on here in the Dakotas. And yes, I think the industry as a whole is excited or glad that we are essential workers and we get to keep on doing our work, and that planting, as long as the supply chain remains unchallenged for fertilizer and seed and those things, as long as that all goes through, planting should go on apace. We have a nice clear window of weather here that should hopefully get some things dried out and help that scenario.
And then corn continuing to be a big story. I know that everybody's focused on what's next with ethanol. So kind of give us a sense of how the market has been handling this over the past week or so.
That is the big weakness in corn. Other than that, the corn market should be fairly stable. These grain markets in general should be stable because there is still the demand. But the fuel demand has been severely affected by this coronavirus. So looking forward, it really depends on how long the coronavirus affects driving demand. If you see folks not driving to work, not driving to school, not driving to events, that reduces the fuel demand. So how long does that continue? You're talking about ethanol plants already slowed down. It's It's really hard to project an overall volume that will be lost because we don't know how long it will last. Already we're seeing the lowest ethanol production numbers we've seen in a decade. So it's not too surprising that we've seen corn basis weaken 10 to 15 cents locally in all locations where there are ethanol plants. And we're seeing cash prices on average in this country already slipping below $3 per bushel. So that is the weakness, is the fuel demand.
Do you think maybe it complicates matters that a lot of folks are gearing up to plant even more corn this upcoming season? So do you foresee that as a problem over the next few months? And maybe is there anything producers can do now to try and get ahead of the game in that regard?
I don't necessarily think that the numbers that we saw in the March Prospective Plantings Report are going to come to fruition because the world has changed that they went out. I think already farmers are able to see the different price ratio between soybeans and corn, or between spring wheat and corn, and see the opportunities in some other crops. And I don't think we're going to see that 97 million acres of corn.
And finally today, Elaine, I saw a quote from you in an article where you mentioned that all the assets in the grain market are moving together, and all in all, they've been kind of moving in a downward direction. So what have you been telling producers as to how they can navigate business decisions amid COVID-19?
Yeah, I think there is potential for more bearishness. So if it's possible, I mean, if you're a fairly efficient producer, likely that you might even be able to lock in profits even at these disappointing levels that we're seeing right now. So that's always the strategy, is to lock in a profit if it's there. If it's not there, again, to be aware that there could be more pain before this ever gets better, and that this could be a fairly long-term effect that affects crude oil prices, that affects ethanol prices, and that ultimately affects corn prices and soybean prices and everything. There's certainly the potential for all of this demand destruction to make things worse.
Next week, we'll be joined by Luke Beckman from Central Valley Ag. If you have a question you'd like for me to ask him, email us or get in touch on social media, and I'll pass your question along. Next up, many dairy producers are also feeling the strain from the COVID-19 pandemic. That's resulting in gallons of milk going to waste because there's just not the market for it that there was a couple months ago. However, one option to get some value from the milk that would otherwise be thrown away is to use it as fertilizer. Livestock and Environmental Engineer Rick Koelsch joined me to explain how it could work.
Well, it has certainly the fertility components that are important for growing a corn crop or other crops. It certainly has a nitrogen value to it, a phosphorus, potassium value, all nutrients that are important to a crop. It's just that they're not going to be worth near as much as a fertility product as they would as a product that we put on the shelves of our stores. We would typically find that in 1,000 gallons of milk applied, there's 46 pounds of nitrogen, about 26 pounds of phosphate. So you think in terms of applying maybe 4,000 gallons of milk per acre, you would have all the fertility needs of a corn crop for the nitrogen, and some even a little bit left over for the next year's phosphorus needs.
And you mentioned corn. Are there certain crops that this works better for than others?
It certainly would gain its greatest value for a crop that is a non-legume crop, such as corn or wheat, as an example. It's a good place to gain value out of the protein or the nitrogen value of that milk. All of the nutrients in milk, whether it be the nitrogen, the phosphorus, are going to be a crop available in the very first year. So we would just, in the planning process, assume that 100% of that 46 pounds of nitrogen is going to be available to this year's crop. We can put it in a legume type crop, let's say put it in prior to soybeans, or add it after we've harvested, immediately after we've harvested an alfalfa crop when we haven't had much regrowth. We could certainly apply it, and those crops will utilize the nitrogen. But if they didn't have that nitrogen available, they would fix their own nitrogen. So it's not like we're saving any dollars by putting it on a legume crop.
What are some obstacles that one might run into when using milk as a fertilizer?
Okay. My major thought process would focus on there are a couple of environmental risks associated with milk if we were to land apply it, and how do we minimize those risks? The first thing I'm concerned about is milk has a very high, what we call biological oxygen demand, and that's just when that milk gets into an aerobic environment like the soil, it's going to break down quickly with the microbes that are in that soil, and it's going to consume a lot of oxygen. So if milk were to ever reach waters of the state, it will use up that oxygen in that surface water and potentially kill fish. They say that 1 pint of milk consumes enough oxygen to remove all the oxygen from 1,600 gallons of water. So it doesn't take a lot of milk in water to create an environmental risk. So put it on land where we can do that biology in the soil, and we don't want that biology to occur in water. The second issue we worry about is that milk is going to degrade pretty quickly. The aerobic bacteria in the soil are going to be breaking it down. But during that process, it's going to release a fair amount of odor. So it can be a concern for neighbors that are nearby a site where we've land applied milk. We'd like to see that milk incorporated into the soil if at all possible, either injected or dissed under. That should reduce most of those odors. If it's going to be surface applied, we'd really like to look at a weather forecast and ask in the next couple of evenings, what is the direction the wind is going to be blowing, and are there any neighbors downwind of where we were thinking of applying that milk? Because those odors in the evening hours is when we get our inversions of air and inversion of odor near the ground level. And if we avoid applying it in a location that would have neighbors downwind the next couple of evenings, that would minimize that risk of odors.
If you're interested in using milk as a fertilizer or donating some of your extra milk, reach out to your local extension office. Next up, although he's no stranger to high-yielding corn, when asked about his strategy for growing 300 bushel corn, Marvin Wiles is quick to say one of the top factors is luck. For someone who is strictly rain-fed, that may be somewhat fair to say, but raising nearly 300 bushel per acre corn in a year like 2019 is nothing to sneeze at. The Wiles brothers placed first in Nebraska in the 2019 National Corn Growers Association Yield Competition Dryland No-Till category. Read about their strategy and some of the challenges faced in 2019 in the April Nebraska Farmer. Time now for weather with Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. And Al is joining us from his remote weather office today with this week's forecast. How's it looking, Al?
Well, we sure had some interesting weather over the past week, Troy, and it looks like we finally might see some sunshine, as we like to say, down the road. Certainly had two major systems to work with this last week and some very significantly cold weather that broke through most of the upper Midwest into the Central Plains. I do expect that we'll see some freeze damage to at least some of the wheat crop in Kansas. Potentially, we might see some of that damage here in southern Nebraska. But the more important thing we're looking out for is that we're going to finally get rid of the snow and look at some more warmer temperatures. And as we get closer to the planting season, maybe some much better conditions as we go forward in time. So as we go to the upper air models, today's upper air pattern features a troughing pattern over the upper Great Lakes and also some energy moving on the west coast, which is expected to slide to the south of Nebraska. Surface lows over southeastern Wyoming and also over the Texas Panhandle. Most of the major precipitation is over the eastern United States, and that's shutting off the moisture flow back from this system. So we expect nothing but a few showers over Kansas. And we see a little bit of wave of energy moving down the pipeline Sunday afternoon, might impact some few showers in northwestern Nebraska, but overall, firmly in control over the state. Should see some temperatures of basically normal to slightly above normal, as most of the precipitation skirts to the southeastern United States. On Monday, we see some energy moving into the southwestern United States, and that will start to eject a piece of energy out into the southeastern portions of Colorado. With this high pressure system over the deep southern portions of the United States will block the return flow. So we expect basically dry conditions until Tuesday. This trough starts to make greater inroads into Texas. Surface low starts to form over the Texas Panhandle, and that will start to feed moisture toward the north, and we should see some scattered shower and thunderstorm activity breaking out south of the I-80 corridor. Why more widespread precipitation as the system starts to move up into the lower portions of the Mississippi River Valley, and that will bring a big fetch of moisture up into the Midwest, potentially bringing some scattered thunderstorm activity into extreme southeastern Nebraska, but most of northwestern and western Nebraska should remain dry. On Thursday, that system starts to lift up into the Ohio River Valley. We get more of a zonal flow, so much warmer conditions. We do see a surface low development in the Texas Panhandle, but with most of the main activity over this big low over the Ohio River Valley, not going to get much in the way of return flow. And as we get in Friday, yet another system starts to dive from the Pacific Northwest. This one's going to dive down into Texas as we get into the weekend, start to see a surface low forming in Texas. But the main cold air will remain well to our north. There was some precipitation breaking out over the central Rockies, and there are some signs that this will start to eject out as we go into next week. And so as we look at the 8 to 14-day forecast, including next weekend through the following Tuesday, we see that the warmth will continue as the main cold air remains over the Great Lakes. And in terms of precipitation, with that system ejecting out, there is a slight increase in the terms of precipitation. But overall, it appears to me that this is the most likely will impact more the southeastern United States and eastern seaboard. Well, it's overall, we look at the overall pattern. We've been some very cold temperatures lately, and the temperatures have come with this rebound in temperatures. I expect that we will start to see activity picking up in earnest, especially with the forecast for warmer conditions. One fly in the ointment is to watch the system coming out next week with a little bit farther northward drift. And more importantly, watch out for another storm system coming at the beginning of the month. But overall, it looks like warmer conditions, which should promote a kickoff to our planting season in earnest.
Thanks, Al. Finally today, as planting ramps up, it's important to remember how soybean herbicides that may be left over from last year could impact new varieties of corn going into the field. Nebraska Extension Weed Management Specialist Amit Jhala joined me to discuss the main points you need to consider if rotating from soybeans to corn.
It is very important this year because, Troy, if you remember, last year was not so good. We had early season flood and then continuous rain. So corn and soybean planting was very late in the season last year. And so do application of pre-emergence as well as post-emergence herbicides. So it is important to know how much is the planting interval for corn from the herbicides applied last year in soybean. For example, some pre-emergence herbicides like Trivens and Light, those are all great pre-emergence soybean herbicides, but they have 10 months of planting interval with corn. So for example, if soybean was planted last year in June, then you have to maintain those 10 months interval.
And yeah, talk to us about planting interval. Remind our viewers what that is, and especially how it relates to soybean herbicides and how a longer planting interval could impact this year's corn planting.
So planting interval is like the time that you have to give after applying certain herbicides and planting certain crops. So for example, there are several herbicides being applied in soybean. For example, any herbicide with fomesafen active ingredient, for example, Flagstar GT, Reflex, all are great examples of fomesafen based herbicides. And so if they are applied in soybean last year, and several of them are applied post-emergence. So, and I remember last year, even in August, growers were applying post-emergence herbicides because planting was very late. And so if you think about applying those herbicides in August and counting 10 months of planting interval with corn, then they cannot basically plant until June or July, depending on when that herbicide was applied last year.
And then I think another thing worth mentioning, it's important for folks to understand that popcorn and sweet corn are more sensitive to herbicides compared to field corn. So the application and management is going to be different, right?
That is true. And I can give you example, for example, Pursuit, which is a post-emergence herbicide in soybean. So if growers, they have applied pursuit last year, then the planting interval for field corn and seed corn is 8.5 months. But when it comes to sweet corn and popcorn, it is 18 months. So basically you cannot really plant sweet corn or popcorn in the same ground where pursuit was applied last year in soybean. So it is important to consider all this planting interval of soybean herbicides, particularly if you are interested in to plant sweet corn and popcorn.
What are some things that you've seen happen when producers don't follow the recommended guidelines for planting interval or proper application?
So two things that I can mention. Number one, we have to follow label guideline because label is a legal document. And second, if you don't follow label, then you may end up with having crop injuries.
And finally, what are any of the other top questions that you're getting from producers this year that you might want to tell us about?
This time of the year, I'm getting questions about which type of burn-down herbicides they can use, particularly for management of glyphosate-resistant mare's tail that we do have in several corn and soybean fields in Nebraska, as well as how temperature and cold weather can also affect the efficacy of burn-down herbicides. So this type of the questions I'm getting right now, and that's why I recommend growers to go through 2 or 3 articles I have written on this topic in CropWatch.
You can find more information on this topic on UNL's CropWatch website, and we've also posted a link with more resources on the Market Journal website. That's going to do it for this week's show. Remember, if you missed a story, you can download the Market Journal mobile app or follow us on social media to join in on the conversation. And also don't forget, you can get the latest updates on the coronavirus outbreak at covid19.unl.edu. Hope to see you right back here next time. I'm Troy Moling. Thanks for watching.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.